In a way, those last three words in that video are what we're doing. Not just in the Jesus season at large, but in this particular series that will end it. We are coming, we are gazing at Jesus, and we are deciding how to respond. This last series is simply a consideration about that key symbol of the Christian faith, the cross. Most Christian people, even probably lots of non-Christian people, esteem the crucifixion of Jesus. They hold it in very high regard. But if you were to ask even the most experienced Christian, what's the cross all about? Why should it be so special to us? How does it, quote unquote, save us? We have a very hard time articulating that answer. So all I'm trying to do for us in this series is to help you maybe begin to gaze upon the cross of Jesus a little clearer, a little better, with a little more understanding, so that you'll begin to grasp why we value it so much. And maybe you could even begin to explain it to somebody else. And I suspect that the way that we talk about the cross today will be new to most of you, because it was to me when I landed upon it or was taught it about 15 years ago. For this series, we are using the author in your New Testament who writes the second most amount of books. So he is a very important figure in your New Testament and very often overlooked in what he has to say, in this case about the cross. And that's the writer John, who was a disciple of Jesus, and we are specifically using his gospel, which bears his name, to teach us why the cross matters so much. Last week, we talked in the first week of this series about one of the ways that John sees or understands the crucifixion of Jesus. And it has a lot to do with this Old Testament Jewish festival and event called Passover. If you weren't here for that, you can find it online and find out why that matters so much. John has about between 6 and 8 major ways that he talks about or understands the cross. It's not just one. We're going to talk about another one today. To do that, I need you to think about something for a moment. I want you to think about the word glory, or its cognate, glorious. How do you use that word in everyday conversation? How do you hear it used in everyday conversation? I've actually made it a point over the last couple of weeks, knowing that this message was coming, to do that, to listen to the television or to listen to the radio or to listen to conversations and to try to clue into how this word is used in 21st century America. Perhaps you'd observe with me that one of the things that you notice right off about this word is we don't use it very often, right? It's kind of fallen out of favor or out of regular usage. Here are some of the ways I've seen it used in the last couple of weeks since I've been trying to pay attention to it. It's a word that is used of excellence. It's a word that is used of, I have heard it over the last 2 weeks on ESPN, used of LeBron James. That his athletic prowess is glorious. I've heard someone on the morning news program use it about a swimsuit model. That woman, scantily clad, is glorious. I bet you've heard it used that way too. How else have you used that word? How else have you heard it used? I've heard someone say that they experienced, quote unquote, glory out in nature. That they had the chance to take a long drive, and there out in the rural parts of Michigan, as winter turns to spring, they experienced a kind of awe or wonder or transcendence, and for that they use the word glory. I bet you've experienced that kind of thing in your life, where you've been on the beach in the summertime or watching the fall colors, and you would use a word like glorious about those things, right? I also, funniest usage that I just happened across was that. And depending on the moment, it is oh so glorious indeed. All right, let me ask you another question, now that you're thinking. What about that phrase? The glory of God. God's glory. That's an unbelievably churchy, obtuse, hard to understand phrase, right? Even for those of us who are familiar with the Bible or have been in church for a long time, it's very hard to come to terms with. But how have you heard that defined or used? Perhaps you, like the psalmist in the Old Testament, Psalm chapter 8, would say that the heavens declare the glory of God. That there is something about the wonder, the intricacy, the depth, and the marvel of nature that reveals God's glory. Okay? Maybe you've heard that phrase used about God being different than any other creature, God being different than any other person, that He's unique and He's better than us. He is more righteous, just, good, and true than us. The Bible's other word for that would be holy. But maybe you've heard that kind of thing about God, and maybe you think, okay, maybe that's what it means that God is glorious. He's just that big, He's just that hard to comprehend, He's just that much better than us. Okay. I'd like to change the way you understand that expression this morning, courtesy of the Gospel of John. This is a verse that occurs in the introduction to the Gospel of John, which is the first 18 verses of chapter 1. Pretty famous verse. If you've been in church, you've probably heard it before. John says of the Jesus that he will describe in his Gospel, and then the Word, or Jesus, became flesh and was a tabernacle among us. And we have seen, oh, there's our word, His glory, the glory of the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. I wonder what John means. Well, he gives you a little bit of a clue, and if you're biblically literate, you pick up on it. Many of his readers would have been. It's right there in that word that he chose. That Jesus, God's Son, who was full of glory, came and tabernacled among us. For those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament, a bell should be going off in your head. Oh, the tabernacle. That has something to do with Israel in the Old Testament, right? Yes. It was their first temple. When they were traveling out of Egypt to the Promised Land, this temple traveled with them. And during the daytime, God's presence at that place was marked by a cloud of smoke, a plume of smoke. And during the night, it was marked by a pillar of flame. This was God's glory. It lived. God's presence was there. God's power was there. God was telling everyone He was with Israel. If you want to find Him, come here to find Him. That's what that word means. So when you look at John chapter 1, verse 14, John is saying about Jesus, hey, just like in the Old Testament, where there was this physical temple that traveled around with Israel from Egypt to the Promised Land, if you want to find God, if you want to see His glory, if you want to know where He is, you have to come to Jesus. because he's like a new tabernacle. But there's a lot about this verse we don't know yet. It's early in John's gospel. He's a good writer. You don't know very much yet about what that means. What exactly is God's glory? What's it mean? How's Jesus display it? Well, as you read through John's gospel, you notice this. All throughout Jesus' life, his ministry and his teaching, in the Gospel of John uniquely, you are told over and over again by Jesus, my hour has not yet come. It's not time yet. Not time for what? Good question. You don't know. But Jesus keeps reminding people all throughout his public life and work, my hour, my time has not yet arrived. Until you hit the last week of his life. And on Palm Sunday, 5 days before his death, you have Jesus in the Gospel of John saying this in chapter 12, verse 23. The hour has finally come for what? Oh, there's the concept again. For me to be glorified. Okay. Seems like the key question then is, what's about to happen that we would think has something to do with God's glory in Jesus? What exactly is it? You don't have to guess. Jesus continues throughout that last week of his life in the Gospel of John to tell you about this hour of his that has finally come. This hour in which he is going to be glorified and God through him. Like, for instance, the first citation up there, again happening on Palm Sunday, 5 days before his death. This is Jesus praying. And he says, now my soul is troubled, and what should I say? Father, save me from this hour. No, this hour is the very reason I have come. Therefore, Father, glorify your name. On what we call Maundy Thursday, the night when Jesus observed the Passover feast, but we now come to call communion, with his disciples, Jesus says this in John chapter 13. Now, before the festival of Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go to the Father. The very last thing Jesus does in the Gospel of John, recorded uniquely in that Gospel, before he goes out to Gethsemane to be betrayed and ultimately murdered, is he prays. And that prayer is recorded in John chapter 17. Notice the opening remarks of that prayer. Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. So you have to ask again, what exactly is Jesus saying? What hour has finally come? How has his time finally arrived to glorify God? To express God's glory in a way that has not ever been seen before and never will be seen again. What was Jesus about to do that screamed out, God is here, God is present, God is unique, God is remarkable? What was he about to do? He was about to die. That's what he was about to do. He was about to get tried falsely, accused of things he never did. He was about to be beaten and tortured and then ultimately murdered at the hands of the Roman and Jewish authorities. To which any sane person listening to this in the Gospel of John goes, what? What on earth, John, are you talking about? I get it that this happened historically, but I have no conception of how you can equate the death of Jesus with glory. What on earth are you talking about? How can the death of the remarkable Jesus be the place where God is seen the most? Where God seems the most honorable, the most holy, the most present? How can that possibly be? How is it that this, the cross, somehow screams out that God is here more than a sunset ever will, more than nature ever will, more than the love of the person in your life who loves you the most ever will, more than those moments of closeness you sense when you pray ever will? How is it that the crucifixion of Jesus is somehow in John's mind equal to God's glory? You can tell what John is doing. John is radically redefining the way that human beings think about glory, and even frankly God's glory. What makes God, the God of all things, the God of the universe, the Father of all life, what makes God honorable? What makes him worth reverence? What makes him glorious? It's not what you think, according to the Gospel of John. If you just take what you have seen over the course of the Gospel of John, and you begin to ruminate and wrestle with him deciding that the most glorious thing he's ever seen, the place where he has seen God's glory the most, was in the ugly death of Jesus on a cross, you begin to realize some very deep, fundamental things need to shift and change inside of you about what you think about God and what you think about glory. Like, for instance, John seems to be intentionally undercutting what most of us naturally think about glory and honor, and frankly about God. What's this? You don't have to answer aloud. A lot of you know the Ten Commandments. What's the second command in the Ten Commandments? Don't make any idols of me. This is what God said to Israel in the Old Testament. It's great that you love me. It's great that you revere me. Let me tell you something not to do. Don't ever try to render who I am down into some kind of concrete form. You know why he said that? Because invariably, over its history, here's what human beings have always done about God. In the words of the German philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, you know what we do? We make God like us. And in the end, when we try to describe or define God for ourselves, he ends up looking like us. This is why the American God sounds so successful and so powerful. This is why it seems like in churches that God is in America is on the side of the successful, or those who are able to make their life work. Whether or not there's any merit to those definitions of God, let me tell you that's something that is true about those definitions of God. They look a heck of a lot like us, and therefore they are specious definitions of God. John, in saying that the cross of Jesus is the place where you will see God's presence the most and you will experience God's glory the most, seems to be intentionally undermining what we usually do about God. Think of the ways that we talk about God. Well, we love God because God is so powerful and so majestic. And if I just pray to him enough, or pray in the right way, or have enough faith, then this God who can do anything will do what I need him to do on my behalf. Oh, really? I don't think it works that way, number one. And number two, I think you're making God like how you want him to be again. That's not what John would say. John sees God defined. John sees God most in the humiliating, painful death of the just and righteous Jesus. That's where he says, oh, you want to find God in the world? Fantastic. Look right there. Stop making idols of God, John seems to be saying. To all of us who are Christians, this is a sobering reality check. If the God we talk about and the God we pray to and the God we trust and the God we think saves us doesn't look like the humiliated Jesus on the cross, then I don't know that we're understanding God and the God of all things correctly. And if you are willing to let the cross define who God is, it will free you. And what you think about God, you may find this is a God worth believing in. Not some simple God who is powerful and gets his way all the time, controls every little thing in the universe. I don't see that in the cross. Do you? Keep going. John says that the glory of God arrived and shone like a flame in the cross of Jesus more than it ever has anywhere else before or since. What else does that make you think? It means that God himself is most present, he is most seen, and he is even most powerful in what? In suffering and sacrifice. That's what. Have you had your fill of people defining power in the wrong way? That to be someone who has influence, or to be a quote-unquote leader, or to be someone who exercises power means that you're the one with whom the buck stops. Or you're the one to whom people answer. Or you're the one who gets to have his way in the conversation whenever there's a problem to be solved or a disagreement to be fixed. This is how the world defines power. This may be how American culture defines power. So that some of you in the room think you're powerful because you're influential or persuasive, and many of you in the room think you're not powerful because you're not those things. I got news for you. That has nothing to do with Christian power. That has nothing to do with God's power, if the cross defines who he is. No. You want to know what the God of the universe is like? Do you know when he's at the most at work? Do you know when you can see him the clearest, according to John? When his glory is most on the scene. It is in suffering and sacrifice. It is in those who seem like they are helpless, but they are working for the right reason. It is in those who suffer at the hands of other people for the right reasons. The new Pope, who, if you've been watching my Facebook page, I've been completely fascinated with over the last week. The new Pope said of the largest Christian church in the world, the Catholic Church, that he hopes one thing happens in the Catholic Church. He says over the course of his papacy, he hopes that the church will be for the poor and the church will learn from the poor, quote, unquote. You know why he says that? Because the poor understand what real power is and what it's not. They understand that it is in sacrifice and it is in suffering that you really do find God and his work and his presence. Not in all the ways we tend to talk about it. This, by the way, should tell you in your own life, where do you think you're going to be able to find God the most or the clearest? Where? Is it in your successes? Oh, there are so many American Christians who think that. They think every time they get ahead, it's like a blessing right from God's hand. It may well be. But that is not the answer. The answer is not that you will find God the most clearest in your life in your successes, in your surprising blessings that come out of nowhere. No, I'm sorry. God's glory that lives and breathes and shines, like at the tabernacle in the Old Testament, you know where it lives most? In the death of His Son. And every time we consider the death of Jesus for the right reasons and the right cause at the hands of wrong people, we remember that that's where God lives most. You want to know where you're going to find the God the most in your life? When your life begins to look like the cross. And you have found ways to say, I'm going to do the hard things. I'm going to do the uncomfortable things. I'm going to do the things that may cost me. I'm going to do the things that other people may not like. I am going to be willing to take the cross of Jesus upon my own back, deny myself, and walk with it day after day after day, as Jesus Himself says at the end of Luke 9. That's where God lives. God's glory is in the cross of Jesus. Most fundamentally, of course, you have got to pause, hit the brakes, and really begin to rethink what you understand the person of God to be. By this simple presentation by John in his gospel, in which he declares that the cross of Jesus is the single place where we find God's glory. It tells you so much about the character of God Himself. You can do this little experiment. You're going to have a hard time doing it for yourself after I tell you about it. You can do it with other people. Make a list of the things or character qualities that you would associate with God. Just write them down on a piece of paper. If you do this, here's what you'll find. Christians and non-Christians alike will use words like this about God. He's eternal. He's all-powerful. He's loving. That's a good one. He's gracious. He's all-knowing. He's all-present. He's everywhere. He's everlasting. He's life. He's light. Awesome. That's not a bad list. Here's the problem. That doesn't sound a lot like the glory of God expressed in the cross. Let me make a list of what God is like. If it's true that God's glory is most seen in this, let me make a list. God's humble. The God of all things, who presumably doesn't have to be, is the most humble being on the planet. More than Mother Teresa, more than the most humble person you know, God of all things is humble. God is willing to suffer. Is that on your list anywhere? That God is willing to suffer at the hands of people that you wouldn't think He'd let do it to Him. Right? God of all people in the universe doesn't have to let bullies bully Him, and yet He does. This is in the character of God, if that's His glory. What else is on your list? God sacrifices. God is willing to be lonely and bereft, isolated and hurt for the right reasons. God is willing to let you think He's a loser and a failure because His mission ended on a cross. These are things that the cross tells you about the God of all things, if that's His glory. I suspect that many of you, like me, have spent some of your life misunderstanding who the God of the universe is. You want a little devotional project for the week? Do what I just did in 3 or 4 minutes for yourself sometime. Say to yourself, okay, John in his gospel is telling me that God's glory, His presence, and who He is most present in the crucifixion of Jesus. Now make your list. What's on it? What does the cross tell you about God? My point to you is simple. It's going to change your definition of God. who you think he is and how you think he treats other people. It does not, by the way, stop there. One of the things that John makes very clear in his gospel is that God's glory should not only be seen in or experienced in this Jesus who was willing to die. In fact, the last act of his life before he goes out to Gethsemane to be betrayed and before he is murdered, Jesus in John 17 in that same long prayer says this, praying for his followers. The glory you, Father, have given me, I now want to give to them who follow me, so that they may be one, as we ourselves, Father and Son Almighty, are one. Now you know what he means, right? What's John mean by glory? Not what you thought. How's that make you change the way you think about your own life as a follower of Jesus, trying to be what he taught us to be? Well, I think it has profound effect on you if you know that Jesus' goal for us is to share in his glory. For instance, how will you begin to interpret whether or not God is a part of your life? I'm a pastor. I have conversations with people on a fairly frequent basis. And what they are asking, even if they don't use these words, is, help me find God in my life. I don't see him. It feels like he's passed me by, or somewhere along the line I've deserted him. Where do you find him? Help me. What would John tell you? John would tell you, as many in church history for the last 2,000 years have discovered. He'd tell you, you need to look in the places where your life looks like that. You need to look in the places where you are standing up for the right thing and paying the consequences. You need to look in your life at the places where you're choosing to do what other people might not. You're choosing to do what's hard, not what's easy. Where you're choosing purposefully to suffer or sacrifice or extend yourself for the sake of someone else. John would tell you, if you want to find God, the place that he will most likely be, or certainly the place where he will be the most evident, is in those places. Because that's where he was in Jesus. That's where he was the most clearly seen, in Jesus. That's a different way of looking at things, yes? That no longer are you going to imbibe in the idolatry of thinking that God is only present in your successes. God may be least present in your successes, if the cross of Jesus has anything to say about it. This will change the way you define for yourself what an honorable, worthwhile, glorious life is. You cannot consider how John defines that term without very much radically changing your own. See, before today, if we'd have made up our list of, here's what an honorable life for me looks like, here's what an excellent life for me looks like, here's what a glorious life for me looks like, what would have been on your list? I was talking to somebody before the service today, and we were both lamenting that we have jobs where you basically don't get time off unless you wall it off and make it. I bet for he and I, one of the things on our list would be that we would finally have jobs where we only worked 40, 45 hours a week, and we had plenty of free time, and our kids didn't think we were strangers sometimes. This would be on our list of what it means to be glorious. Or maybe you'd get that surprise letter or email out of the blue from your boss, your supervisor, who says, man, you're doing such a great job. Thank you for being such a hard worker and being so diligent and effective in your role. Thank you. Maybe it's a raise. Maybe it's being able to retire and not be in poverty. This is how we define the good life, the glorious life. Not if you let that define it for you. The glorious life, the good life, the honorable life according to John, looks like a cross. And in it you will find the most freedom. In it you will find the most joy. In it you will find the most purpose. Maybe what you need to do is rethink what you think is most honorable about your life. What's most worthwhile about your life. What's most excellent about your life. Maybe it's the way that you choose to enter into the hurt of other people and to suffer with them. Maybe it's the way that you choose to bend over backward for somebody else. Maybe it's the way that you go at something alone, but you do it because you know it needs to be done. Maybe it's sacrifice. Maybe it's suffering. Maybe it looks like Jesus on the cross. Like I said, I don't know that you've probably ever known that the second most major writer in your Bible defines the cross this way. And because of it, you have to rethink a lot of things in the best way. When you think about God's glory, what makes him worthwhile, what makes him worthy of our reverence and our praise, you have to think about it differently now. It's not because if you don't do it, he's going to get you. It's not because he can do miracles and things that you cannot do. It's not that he is timeless and bigger and better and more powerful than all of us. No. That is not how John defines God's glory. That is not why the Christian God is worth your life. When you think about what's honorable or best in your life, you now have to rethink that too. If you were listening to what John said about glory today. When you think about glory, you think about who God is, you think about where God is in the world. You think about where he can be seen the most in the world. You think about what expresses his character the most. You now have to think about it the way John does. It's the cross of Jesus that expresses who God is, what he does, and who he wants us to be. This is the way that the Japanese-American Christian poet named Edward Shilalito says it in a very short poem. The other gods were strong, but you, our God, were weak. They rode, but you stumbled to a throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak. And not a God has wounds, but you alone. To our wounds, only the wounds of God can speak. And the only God in the world who has wounds like Jesus is the Christian God. That's what he's saying. Let me have the worship team come forward to prepare for communion. Let me also have the elders and deacons who are going to help me serve join me here at the table.